Welcome to In Focus with Ejaz Haider. Our top story tonight is about China's naval exercises in South and East China Seas. China began 5 military exercises simultaneously along different parts of its coast on Monday. That was yesterday. This is the second time in 2 months that China is conducting concurrent drills. 2 of the exercises are being held near the Parasil Islands in South China Sea, one in East China Sea, and one further north in the Bohai Sea. In the southern part of the Yellow Sea, drills including live fire exercises will be held from Monday to Wednesday. In a bid to train a combat-ready military force, China holds military drills periodically, but rarely do multiple exercises happen at the same time. Last month, China announced 4 separate exercises from the Bohai Sea to the Eastern Yellow Seas and down to South China Sea. According to a Reuters report, Chinese military experts said this was rare arrangement of drills. The United States and its allies, especially in the Quad, which includes Japan, Australia, and India, have been voicing concerns over Chinese activities in South China Sea. For its part, China has been invoking its enthusiasm for the 2002 Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea, a dialogue framework between China and ASEAN states about the implementation of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. China's position is that China and other littoral states of South China Sea can work out arrangements without interference by external parties, a pointed reference to the US and its interests. Most Western analysts say China has become interested in DOC because it can now negotiate from a position of strength. Tonight's discussion will seek to look at the broader political strategic picture and also China's naval modernization. We are joined by Dr. Guy Burton. Dr. Burton, author and adjunct professor at Vasilius College. Mr. Einar Tangen, who's a writer and commentator on political and economic issues and joins us from Beijing. Later, we'll also be joined by former Commodore Syed Obaidullah, a defense and maritime analyst who had a distinguished career in Pakistan Navy. Let me begin with Dr. Burton. Dr. Burton, what is the broader play here? I mean, we know the interests, China's interests, and also the US interests. And we also believe, if we look at it in and through structural realism, that yes, there's the existing power, there's the emerging power. Does it necessarily lead to conflict? Is China entering into a Monroe Doctrine of sorts of its own?
Well, thank you very much for having me on the show today. And I mean, to answer your questions, I think, there's a couple of things that should probably be pointed out here, which is that, part of the reason that China is doing these simultaneous exercises is to basically demonstrate both to itself that it is prepared to be able to to respond to any kind of threat from several different fronts, but also to, there's a public dimension here, which is to show that it's ready to be able to do so. And I think this is very much directed towards the United States, which China has recognized as a strategic rival in its most recent, a white paper on defense. But more broadly, I mean, China sees itself, rather sees, the littoral, the coastline, the seas that are around it, and also, Taiwan and the South China Sea as, as the principal areas where, sort of a potential, conflict may come from. I mean, if you think about, the way that China sees the world broadly, it sees things in sort of concentric circles, with, the party and the homeland at the center. That is obviously its top priority. And then sort of from that spreading out towards sort of regional areas, sort of regional borderlands like, Tibet and Xinjiang regions, and then, of course, Taiwan, and then and the coastline, and then further beyond that to other external interests. And so, for that reason, China sees its position as primarily defensive. It sees its positioning here, its preparation as more one for defending any kind of attack coming to it. Although obviously, here in the West, we're sort of looking at whether, the Chinese are looking to become a bit more aggressive and more assertive in the South China Sea as well as towards Taiwan.
Right. So one of the things about the DOC, as I said, it was penned in 2002. But generally, it was thought that China had been dragging its feet on this. Then, of course, there was the tribunal issue, where China lost out to the tribunal. Of course, China said that it does not really agree with that. But now it seems to the observers that it wants to pull in the states, the ASEAN states primarily, and come across as a state that wants to negotiate its terms rather than coerce. Is this something which might have to do with a realization that within its near abroad, especially in the South China Sea, that it needs to have friendly states rather than states that might think that China is inimical and therefore could get pulled into the U.S. ambit?
Yes, I mean, friendly states would be very useful. Although, I mean, one of the things that I think the Chinese are showing here is that, they, as a rising power, as a global power, others have to take into account their position. Now, what is interesting on the South China Sea is, of course, this is a contested, and it's not just contested by the Chinese, but also the other neighboring countries there. China officially says that it supports the idea of a peaceful dialogue and settlement. Although I think it veers more towards relating to finding resolution that is bilateral. So on individual one-to-one relations with each state rather than sort of doing a multilateral approach. Because, of course, bilaterally, China is in a much greater position of strength to do that.
Right. So, right. You have the example of Cambodia, and you have the example of Laos, and also to some extent the Philippines. But stay with me, Dr. Burton. Let me pull in Mr. Einar Tangen here. Mr. Tangen, how does China look at this activity? What kind of signaling is this? Is this purely defensive? Is this a sense of projection of power and the reach of the naval flag? What exactly is this?
Well, it's a mixture of all of the things that you just mentioned, but primarily defensive. I mean, right now, China is feeling that they're under attack from all directions. I mean, there's 360 degrees of pressure being put on China, not only militarily, but also economically and politically. The whole idea of creating this Quad, manufacturing this term that there's an Indo-Pacific, that term was used loosely a few years back, but has never been taken seriously until the United States wanted to add more heft to its particular foray in this area. Now, remember, from the Chinese perspective, what they're concerned about is this idea that they could somehow be blockaded. China is in the bottom 100 of countries on a per capita resource base. So they have to have resources in order not only to manufacture goods for export, value added, but also this in terms of their own internal consumption. So there was this growing concern that the U.S., with its 400 bases located in strategic areas, would encircle China and prevent it from getting the resources it needed. That's why the Belt and Road Initiative, which was originally started, but since then has taken on a life of its own. So I agree with my colleague Guy that that was a very balanced analysis of things. The question is, there is something a little bit more to it than just the things that we're talking about. And I would point to this idea that the U.S., in the West, democratic countries really believe that democracy and capitalism are not only the best system of government and economics, but the inevitable one. It's a very ideological stance. And they see China as having a different system. Therefore, it cannot be good. But China's success is this kind of existential threat to this kind of status quo that especially the U.S. feels that it's superior in this. So that's why you're seeing a lot of this kind of feeling, emotional feeling, that somehow China has cheated, that it's not following the plan. The whole idea of joining the WTO was that China, by encouraging capitalism, democracy would break out, and there would be, in essence, a regime change. But instead, China became wealthier and more powerful. So, as I said, there's this existential threat of China's success, which is driving a lot of this kind of friction between these powers. And unfortunately for China, Europe is also feeling this in terms of emotion, which is strange because, quite frankly, Europe is more socialist than pure capitalist.
Right. I am going to go with a question to Dr. Burton, but Mr. Tangen, I will return to you with the same question. So just listen in on this. Dr. Burton, when we look at the period of Deng Xiaoping, where China really took off, Deng had a sense of, and he also, if I remember correctly, coined a phrase which basically meant that we need to develop but stay below the radar. Our light should not really shine forth in any aggressive manner. And that's what China did. Now, under President Xi Jinping, for the last 5 years, if not more, we seem to get a sense that China is now becoming more assertive. Is this something which is innate to President Xi's policy, or is this some kind of reaction to how the United States and its allies have begun to look at China's rise?
Well, it's probably a bit of both, actually. I mean, certainly as we've been discussing, there has been a reaction to China's rise, but I mean within China as well, there has been sort of this sense of a shift of biding one's time, not trying to be too confrontational, building up the economy, building up the Chinese development from the period of Deng, and even under sort of Xi's predecessor Hu Jintao, there was this sense that China was a rising power, that it must make sure that its rise is seen as peaceful and non-confrontational. But we're now reaching a point where China is very much the second largest economy on the planet. It is got significant weight. It's been spending significantly in militarily as well. And so there is this sense that things have been sort of shifting regardless of who was in charge. Now, bring Xi into it, I think certainly there has been some changes with the individual that he is. Remember, he came to he took the top job back in 2012 on the basis of a campaign to root out corruption, which very much got caught up with eliminating or at least reducing the influence of political challengers towards him. Of course, that has created its own potential problems later on. One of the things about Deng when he was in power in the 1980s was to make decision making as broad as possible. What we've seen under Xi is a much more of a narrowing to Xi and the people around him. And if you recall back at the 2017 Communist Party conference, there was a shift to remove term limits, so therefore putting Xi in a stronger position. Now that could, so long as China remains strong economically, militarily, that reinforces Xi's position. But of course, the threat is what happens if Xi becomes weak? What if it becomes ill? What if he dies? There is a growing sense of disconcert. With that. In the absence of a broader collective approach, this could actually backfire for the Chinese later on.
One final question, Dr. Burton. Given what China is doing, which we were just discussing, and given the U.S. approach, especially analyses that are coming out of inside the Beltway, what are we looking at? Are we looking at something which is, in terms of a conflictual model, that is inevitable? As you know, Graham Allison has done an entire book on that, calling it the Thucydides trap. But is that inevitable?
They're hoping that it won't be. I mean, certainly one of the things that the Chinese have been trying to do as they've been developing their military position and their military capabilities is to also to check the risk of things running out of control. So setting up sort of crisis management processes to ensure that things like what happened back in the Cold War with the Cuban Missile Crisis never happens again. Of course, all this planning can come to naught. In the heat of the moment. But certainly, I think there is a sense on both sides to not necessarily lead to a direct violent confrontation between the two. But we mustn't lose sight of the possibility that, we will very much likely see, increasing confrontation sort of in proxy format. Although admittedly at the moment, with the Chinese prioritizing, defensive capabilities around the homeland, that's possibly less likely to happen in other parts of the world. But certainly we shouldn't discount that.
Right. Thank you so much. Dr. Guy Burton speaking with us. Let me go back to Mr. Tangen. Mr. Tangen, the question with reference to Deng Xiaoping and Xi Jinping, what is your reading of that?
Well, actually, I think they're very similar. Just imagine if Deng had taken over now as opposed to then. Remember, when Deng took over China, the leadership there, he was, in essence, a supreme leader. He didn't try to, take the titles and things like that. But he was in a very difficult position. China was extremely weak. It had been racked by, kind of internal unrest with the Cultural Revolution. And there was basically no money in the till. So he was in a position where there wasn't much choice. You had to hide your light. You had to do the best you could. But, one wonders what he would do today. Now, in terms of Xi, I think Xi is actually copying a lot of what Deng did. Deng came in. He actually centralized things. He was the source of power. There was no dispute as to that. And what he did is, before he left power, he made sure that the decision-making process was decentralized. He didn't do it initially. It wouldn't have been possible. There were too many who opposed, who actually believed in the kind of ongoing revolution, thought it was Mao's legacy to continue that. But he went in a different direction. The country wanted that. It has led to a period of tremendous expansion within China. And now with Xi, I think he sees a very difficult situation, a very hostile the U.S., who is using everything in its power to kind of vilify China, to make China the other. And as I said, in response to my colleague, Guy, I would say that the only way to stop this kind of mechanical march towards doomsday is for everybody to realize that there is more than one path to success, that there are, in fact, not a clash of civilizations, but just different ones, and that we have to respect those and get along with them. The United States was founded on that entire principle. They could not be one religion because there were so many different religions, including people who did not even believe in God. All right, there were so many different peoples, and it was understood that the only way to get along is to say, look, what happens in your house is your business. What happens in mine is mine. And that was an extension, in essence, of what the Europeans did between the Catholics and Protestants when they had done slaughtering each other wholesale, villages, men, women, and children. They got so exhausted that they decided that, yes, what's in your country is your business, what's in mine is mine. And I think we need to return to that if there's any hope of having kind of this multilateral consensus, which should be about trade, about improving the lives of individuals in those areas, and having a collective response to the kinds of emergencies that we're facing today. Not only the health consequences of COVID, where we see a complete lack of coordination, but also the economic after effects, which are going to require a tremendous amount of effort to get the world back on track. Without this kind of realization that we can live together, although we are different, we are, in fact, headed on a very dark road.
Right. In the meantime, we have also been joined by former Commodore Syed Muhammad Obaidullah, as I said, a defense and maritime analyst who had a distinguished career in Pakistan Navy. But before I get to the Commodore for an assessment of the People's Liberation Army Navy, Mr. Tangen, one other thing that Dr. Burton was talking about in terms of the centralization and narrowing of decision-making by Xi Jinping, and he expressed the sort of fear that in the event that she falls ill, or there's a sense that perhaps that could be perhaps a bump in the internal politics of China. Is that something that you would agree with, or do you think that there are mechanisms, sort of cushions, to sort of guard against that?
I've written books about Chinese government at the local level, and I've interacted with people at the higher level. I can tell you this: it's a popular misconception that Xi, is an autocratic individual who just waves his hand and decides things willy-nilly. It's quite the opposite. The whole Chinese government system is based on planning. Planning isn't something you do in 5 seconds. This isn't about a tweet policy kind of government. This is very, very carefully considered. Everything is laid out in advance. They try to place every scenario. So in terms of if Xi were gone tomorrow, it's the Central Committee would elect somebody in his place. Somebody would be moved up. The system would go on. In essence, it's, the way people should think about it is a very corporate system. Large corporations find people 10 years in advance, and they see what they can do, and then they make sure that they select what they think are the best leaders among them to be in that kind of management group. And that's the way you should really be thinking about China, not as as the popular press likes to portray it, as the whims of one person.
Right. That's a very interesting thought. Thank you so much. Pleasure as always, Mr. Einar Tangen. Let's get to Commodore Obaidullah here. Commodore, thank you for your time. We were discussing the concurrent naval drills that China is doing. And we were talking about, before you joined us, we were talking about the political strategic implications of that. But I want you to give us a sense of, or an assessment of, operational assessment of PLA Navy. I believe they ordered a second aircraft carrier. They're also looking at another third carrier. And the interesting thing is that while the first two carriers have this ski jump design for the aircraft, the third one is possibly going to have a catapult launch capability, which is more like the United States Navy. So, but the US Navy carriers, they are groups. Is that also the case with the PLA Navy?
Navies all over the world operate almost in the same way. And when there is a carrier group, it has destroyers, frigates, submarines, aircraft, and it goes like a whole riyasat and in the sea. And the center of the whole body of this particular maneuver is aircraft carrier, and around it to protect and to operate are destroyer, frigate, submarine, etc. So, and the Chinese Navy is now with 300 units in the Navy, is the biggest Navy of the world. They have a lot of submarines. They have now is adding more aircraft carrier. They are late into inducting of carrier in their in the Navy. But with reference to your drills in the South China Sea and East China Sea and Yellow Sea and Bohai Sea, this is a very current subject in the sense that almost simultaneously 4 or even 5 different Navy drills, Navy exercises are taking place in an area around Chinese coast. One should look at it from this point of view that all these drills were announced a month back. So there is nothing like a surprise in this area. The surprise only is that multiple exercises are taking place in a span of 2 months, which in my opinion is in response to Americans' unprecedented, unparalleled 2 aircraft carrier taking part in the exercises in July this year, that's just about 2 months back, 6th of July or 5th of July, to Ronald Reagan and Nimitz. This was an unprecedented level of exercise in the South China Sea by the American and some others. So I would make an opinion that this unprecedented multi-naval exercises taking place twice within 2 months is in response to the American exercises which were conducted 2 months back. Otherwise, this is something which is a regular feature in all navies. Navies' interaction at sea and their exercises normally take place in the international waters. And those who are adversary or friends can stay at a safe distance and watch the entire exercise and nobody can do anything about it. And while these exercises, Chinese 4 simultaneous exercises were taking place, there were American spy planes, and I would not be surprised there would be ships, etc. And again, let's call them a routine international activities of all navies.
But
example,
in this particular
Navy and Indian Navy.
But in this case, and I think your point is very valid with reference to response, which is an offensive-defensive response signaling. But one final question, Commodore Obaidullah. Aircraft carriers were obviously looked at as force multiplier platforms, especially the group, whether it's frigates, destroyers, the aircraft, and the rest of it, the submarines. But with these anti-ship cruise missiles, there is now a debate whether aircraft carriers can actually, and especially because these missiles, and additionally the hypersonic missiles especially, that aircraft carriers are now extremely vulnerable to this kind of missilery. What are your thoughts about that?
That's true. It has always been that way, that since aircraft carrier is a price target for the enemy, and since aircraft carrier is a pride of a nation and the biggest platform which can operate miles and miles and over long durations, so this is an offensive punch and it is available to only few countries in the world. That goes along with the political strategy or policy of the government. The Chinese policy remains somehow domestically inward, and that is one of the reasons that they have not been able to develop aircraft carrier to an extent that they can match gun for gun, missile for missile. As far as your missile hitting a ship is concerned, all ships are vulnerable, and particularly price target like carrier are vulnerable. They have plenty of soft kill, hard kill weapons, their own as well as those who are protecting aircraft carrier from a reasonable distance of miles and miles. So they always draw a circle around aircraft carrier that no aircraft or missile should approach or should be able to approach the carrier. But nevertheless, while the aircraft carrier and its own missile system, anti-air defense system, anti-missile system is developing, so as the missile capability, speed,
Correct.
and its characteristics are developing. So this is a hide and seek, and this will continue to be that way.
Absolutely, the classic offense equilibrium, disequilibrium. But thank you so much. That was Commodore Syed Muhammad Obaidullah speaking with us. We shall take a short break and return to discuss the continued rise in COVID-19 cases in India and the social impact of the pandemic. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. Our second story tonight is about the rising COVID-19 cases in India and their social impact. The cases have crossed the mark of 6 million, and so far, more than 96,000 people have unfortunately died from coronavirus-related complications. While India trails behind the United States, which has crossed the 7 million mark, the last 2 weeks have seen India top the chart of deaths with 14,252 deaths compared to America's 9,291 and Brazil's 8,939. The Indian economy, which had slowed down pre-COVID, has been badly hit by the pathogen. Increasingly, however, analysts have begun to talk about the social impact of the pandemic. To discuss both aspects tonight, we have Ms. Yamini Aiyyar, President, Center for Policy Research, Delhi, and Dr. Anant Bhan, who's a public health researcher and joins us from Bhopal. Thank you to both my panelists. Let me begin with Ms. Aiyyar. Ms. Aiyyar, you wrote an op-ed in the Hindustan Times in July, which was titled COVID, the State Citizen Trust Deficit. And then you also wrote another op-ed in Hindustan Times in August, which was once again, which talked about reimagining India's welfare toolkit. And both op-eds were, of course, they were prescriptive also, but they were also a bit pessimistic. So do you think that the issues that you raised in those op-eds and which you've been raising in your other work also have still not been addressed, or have been partially addressed, or have been addressed?
Well, I think the way to think about the social challenge of COVID is really in the larger context of India's public health system. And I know Dr. Anant Bhan will talk about this a lot more, but let me just say that pre-COVID as well, India across many decades, despite significant growth in our economy, has ignored our public health system. And a lot of the trust deficit that I was talking about is really a consequence of this long-term ignoring of public health. Our overall investment in public health is less than 2% of GDP. And even though we've repeatedly for decades talked about the importance of investing more, 80% of health expenditure takes place in the private system rather than in the government system, because the government system is broken. And this has been a long overdue fix. I'm hopeful that this experience that India has gone through, along with the rest of the world, in fact, I think COVID is a reminder to the entire world how important it is for us to invest in our public health systems, that hopefully we will see some long-term change. But in the present moment, not only are we tackling COVID in the context of a relatively weak health system, we are also tackling COVID in the context of an economy that was already going through a slowdown. So there certainly was a need for India to ensure that it invests more in its social infrastructure in order to be able to provide a degree of income support, especially to the poorest. Don't forget, India, like many other countries in South Asia, has a large percentage of poor, but in India in particular, we also have 50% of our population, by the World Bank's estimation, is what the World Bank describes as vulnerable. That is, populations who may fall back into poverty with a single income shock. This population suffered immensely when we went into lockdown, and it is urgent and necessary for us to be able to provide more income support and more social security to this population that has suffered, because the economy, although once we started unlocking, has slowly limped back. Our first quarter GDP numbers are not great, as was expected. There is no immediate V-shaped recovery, as was also expected. We are in for a long haul. And in order to ensure that our poor are well protected, we need to have a reimagined and much, much more robust welfare toolkit. We've done better on the provision of food. There was some attempt at expanding the public distribution system, which has become the lifeline for most of India's poor in the context of this COVID-related loss of jobs and so on. But even this needs to be universalized so that all those who are left out of the social security net are able to access. We've done well in rural India by strengthening our National Rural Employment Guarantee Program to make work available. But again here, given that this is now a long haul, a lot more needs to be done. And finally, in urban India, we saw at the start of the lockdown movement of India's migrant worker population that come to the cities for short periods of time for work, moving back to their villages. They are now caught between trying to find work in rural India and also slowly making their way back into the cities. But the economy is only limping back, it's not roaring back, and therefore jobs are still hard to come by. So addressing the problem of urban social security is also extremely important and necessary. I think the Indian government needs to be thinking a lot more about the kind of fiscal stimulus they need to give. The government is indicating that there is another fiscal stimulus in the pipeline, and hopefully that stimulus will be more generous, particularly when it comes to protecting the poor.
Right. Let me go to Dr. Anant Bhan for his initial thoughts before I posit a couple of questions. Dr. Bhan, Ms. Aiyyar has put forward some of those issues. I want to get your sense of how you look at things.
Sure. Thank you for having me. So I think as Yamini was rightly pointing out, this pandemic is sort of showing India and actually many other LMICs the problems with their own health systems. We've seen through our experience with the pandemic how ill-prepared we are, how resilience is a major lacunae in our health systems. When we are hit with such a pandemic, it tells us that we have shortage of infrastructure, we don't have enough hospitals, we don't have enough beds, we don't have enough ICUs, ventilators, etc. But also, probably more worryingly, we don't have enough human resources to even man the infrastructure that we have. So we have struggled in being able to provide care, and obviously we also struggled in being able to do public health steps like contact tracing effectively. Now, over the last few months, the governments have tried both at the federal level and at the state level in ramping up some of this infrastructure. But the challenge, obviously, is that these kind of preparations take time and you cannot create human resources overnight. Linked to that also is the fact that public health investments have been scanty in many of our countries in South Asia, including in India, for decades now. And this is something which public health advocates have been arguing for many years now, but hopefully this pandemic will in fact force our governments to invest more in health and ensuring that we have adequate infrastructure and human resources available. The second issue, I think, is the issue of economy, which again, Yamini is an expert in that domain. But as we know, the economy has taken a hit. That is partly the reason why we have gone into unlock, and the unlock also brings its own challenges. The rapid rise in infections over the last few weeks, as you were rightly pointing out in your introductory remarks, is partly a function of that unlock happening. As more and more people are going out, there is a higher chance of transmitting infections, and the numbers are rising. And we're seeing, quite worrying trends as in terms of the numbers. And probably linked to that is also the fact that perhaps we have not been able to do enough to be able to convince the lay public that they need to take public health measures. There is still lots of concerns around masking not being properly done. Either they don't use masks or they don't use them correctly, hand hygiene, physical distancing to the extent possible. All of that, I think, requires adherence from the communities and from individuals, and I don't think we've been able to do to work with communities in ensuring adherence to that. And perhaps that's quite worrisome because there's just been figures released by the Indian Council of Medical Research today, which indicate that in their second seroprevalence study, we are seeing a prevalence rate of around 7%, which is around 1 in 15 individuals about 10 years of age having been having been exposed to infection, which still means that there's a large segment of the population which is susceptible to infection, and we need to do as much as we can to try to prevent further spread, because it could only tax the health system more, and the health system in many parts of India is already quite stressed out.
Right. Well, without prejudice, what you were saying and what Ms. Aiyyar said, I mean, if I were public relationing from the side of the Indian government, I would say, look, everyone has been learning on the curve, and I would have said, look at the United States and look at the US health system. Agreed that, states here in this part of the world lack infrastructure and various other things, but But even the US could not manage, still hasn't been able to manage this pandemic as one would have thought it would. Dr. Bhan.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, and I think we have to be, sure, yes. And we have to understand, I agree with you, and we have to understand that countries like ours are also quite diverse. And what I mean by diversity is the fact that there are parts of India as well which have been relatively doing better. You know, in the south, the state of Kerala has done much better in terms of being able to respond. And that's partly a function of the community-based health system preparedness that they've had in responding to prior outbreaks and epidemic spreads, and also the way they have engaged with the communities right from the top. Similarly, states in the Northeast have done relatively much better because there, I think, the involvement of local communities, church groups, youth groups, working with local leadership in communities has worked relatively better, and so the numbers also are much better in those parts of town of the country in terms of the spread of infection. But yes, there are large sections of the country where we are seeing a major hit. Also, unfortunately, we are now seeing a shift of infection also from urban India to rural India. And as is true in most parts of South Asia, there is a lot of infrastructure and availability of medical professionals in cities, but not so much in rural areas. So as the spread of infection continues in rural India, the chances of more cases of serious infection and potentially mortality because people are not able to access care enough in time would be something we would worry about. Also because, transport is not still back to pre-COVID-19 levels. So getting people onto a health facility is also taking time. So I agree, there are challenges, and many high-income countries, health systems have also faced those challenges. But I think what we really need to do now in our countries is figure out where we are, what can we learn from other countries and parts of our own countries which have done better, and try to ensure that we minimize the negativity that we are seeing in terms of the impact of COVID-19.
Absolutely. Before I wrap up, back to Ms. Aiyyar here. Ms. Aiyyar, Dr. Bhan was talking about a certain kind of social discipline also, where the citizens understand, things about social distancing. I agree it's extremely difficult given the density of the population and the socio-economic problems. But still, wearing face masks and the rest of it. And one of the operators who talked about the requirement of a relationship of trust between citizens and the state. And you said that this is not something that can be coerced. It has to, emanate if there is trust. So give me a sense of how well the government has been able to do on that front and the response of the public to that now that the cases are rising.
I think as you mentioned the US story, it's an important one because it's also a reminder that this is a disease that we still are learning a lot about. And there is a curve, of both therapeutic knowledge as well as public health knowledge and administrative knowledge that is slowly beginning to evolve. The ability of governments to be agile and respond as our knowledge improves is really, I think, going to be the final determinant, not just in India, I think across the globe. I think when we started in sort of building public administration responses to COVID, the first focus was on containment. So lockdowns were popularized across the globe, and India, of course, went into a lockdown very early, what was widely described as the world's harshest lockdown. I think we now need to recognize that we are moving from containment to managing the disease. Even the public administration narrative has moved to learning to live with the virus. And this is where the trust story is particularly important because as Dr. Bhan was mentioning, the parts of India that have managed the disease better are those parts where have a lot more community involvement. There is, luckily in India, because we are so large and heterogeneous, a very good set of examples of strong community-based health response. Our entire public system has been responding to COVID as if it's an administrative problem that can be solved. Trust will be built if we recognize that this is a problem that requires community level participation and engagement. We contained COVID in the world's largest slum in Dharavi. And the lesson from that was so important. Our ability to do so was precisely because we involved community organizations, non-profits, NGOs in mobilizing and building a relationship with the public for them to not fear the power of the state. Everybody fears the power of the state across the globe. But you have to be able to build a relationship where it's not the fear of the power of the state, but an engagement with the challenge of the disease that helps you resolve it. There's a history of doing this with infectious diseases across the globe and in India. And we should just go back to those lessons. I think we'll be in a much stronger position to respond to COVID, especially as it spreads further into rural India.
I agree with you. Generally, the consensus as far as analyses are concerned, but thank you so much, Ms. Yamini Aiyyar. Thank you, Dr. Anant Bhan, for speaking with us. This is all from In Focus tonight. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.